Well, in the opening chapter to his book titled Disappointment with God, author Philip Yancey makes this observation. He writes that ever since my book, Where is God When It Hurts, was published, he says, I've received letters from people disappointed with God. He writes that a young mother had written to him that her joy had turned to bitterness and grief when she delivered a daughter with spina bifida, a birth defect that leaves the spinal cord exposed. In page after page of tiny spidery script, she recounted how medical bills had sucked up all the family's savings, how her marriage had cracked apart as her husband came to resent all the time she devoted to their sick child. As her life crumbled around her, she was beginning to doubt what she once believed about a loving God. So she wrote to Philip Yancey to ask him whether he had any advice for her. He continues, a homosexual spilled out his story gradually in a succession of letters. For more than a decade, he had sought a cure for his sexual orientation, trying charismatic healing services, Christian support groups, and chemical treatment. He even underwent a form of aversion therapy in which psychologists subjected him to a form of electric shock therapy. Nothing had worked. Finally, he surrendered to a life of gay promiscuity. Philip Yancey writes that he still writes to me occasionally, insisting he wants to follow God, but feeling disqualified because of his peculiar curse. His words. He continues, a young woman wrote with some embarrassment about her ongoing depression. She has no reason to be depressed, she says. She's healthy, earns a good salary, has a stable family background. Yet most days when she wakes up, she cannot think of a single reason to go on living. She no longer cares about life or God, and when she does pray, she wonders whether anyone is really listening. And Philip Yancey makes this comment. He says that these and other letters I've received over the years all lead to the same basic question, but phrased in different ways. It goes something like this. Your book is about physical pain, but what about pain like mine? Where is God when I hurt emotionally? What does the Bible say about that? He says, I answer the letters as best as I can, sadly conscious of the inadequacy of words on paper. Can a word, any word, ever heal a wound? He says, I must confess that after reading these anguish accounts, I ask the very same questions. Where is God in our emotional pain? Why does he so often disappoint us? Well, I wonder whether you're experiencing a similar situation at the moment or similar questions at the moment. Maybe you think it's wrong to even ask such questions or to admit that you have them, but deep down you're wondering, maybe where is God in the midst of whatever it is that you're going through at the moment? I was reading during the week that during this current COVID-19 pandemic, with isolation and social distancing telling us where we can and cannot go, who we can and cannot see, with daily life and routine being turned upside down, with many losing their job or income, or in some cases having family or friends who've contracted this virus, and in some cases maybe even losing their lives, combined with all the anxiety around schooling and housing, of how we can best care for our children or our elderly parents during this time, that according to this recent newspaper article, 1 in 3 Australians are claiming to now be financially worse off than what they were just 6 weeks ago, and 1 in 10 are reporting an increase in depression. And surely within that are Christians as well, who are wondering, how do I make sense of this present situation? And more importantly, where is God in the midst of all of this? What is it he's wanting me to do during this? So, for example, in our situation, we believe 2-3 years back that God was calling us out to the western suburbs into a new community to plant a new church. And so we sold our house, we uprooted our family, we changed jobs, changed schools, we left behind friends, and then moved halfway across the state in what we believe to be obedience to God. And yet now, barely 18 months in, facing a possible loss of job or income, trying desperately to keep our kids in school and all the time wondering what this present pandemic might mean to our small fledgling congregation and church plant, I find myself wondering, did we hear God correctly on this? Or did we somehow get this wrong? Or if this is God's will, then what is he wanting to teach us through this? And why is it that obedience to God can sometimes be so confusing, or dare I say it, even disappointing? Now, to be fair to God, we haven't lost our jobs, we haven't lost our income, and all things going well. There's no reason to assume that things aren't going to go back to normal again in a couple of weeks' time. However, at the same time, I'd be lying if I didn't admit that on certain days, depression and the devil and just the sheer difficulties of life can sometimes play spiritual and emotional havoc with both your heart and your head. Which is why I'm absolutely loving this Bible passage at the moment. Have a look with me again at Mark chapter 1, verses 28 and 29, just here. It says, and immediately he, that is Jesus, left the synagogue and entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law lay ill with a fever, and immediately they told Jesus about her. Now bear in mind for a moment just how extraordinary this simple statement is. Remember, the last time we were in this chapter, just a couple of weeks ago, we were looking at a couple of verses just before this where it was telling us of a miracle which Jesus had just performed in their local synagogue. On that occasion and in that place in which people would have gathered on a Sabbath day in order to remember the goodness of God and to hear the Bible being taught, a man with an evil spirit had come into the synagogue, stood up and began yelling at Jesus in verse 24. What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. Now, on that occasion, Jesus had cast the evil spirit out, leaving the people astonished at the authority and power and teaching of Jesus, whilst this formerly tormented man had gone home at peace with himself and in right relationship with God. And yet likewise, on that occasion and in that situation, we know almost absolutely nothing whatsoever about that particular man, who was probably, to all intents and purposes, a total and complete stranger to Jesus and his disciples. They'd probably never even met him before. And we ourselves, as the readers, we know little to nothing of him. But not so just here. Rather, moving on from the synagogue, we now find Jesus in verses 29 and 30, entering into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John, and where Simon's mother-in-law lay ill with a fever. And immediately they told Jesus about her. Now, this is what is so extraordinary about this passage, and yet which can be easily and quickly overlooked. And that is that, firstly, we know exactly who this woman is. This is Simon Peter's mother-in-law. And she would have, in all likelihood, have been well known to the other disciples, maybe even to Jesus himself already. And she's known. But secondly, and here we're speculating, but I'm suspecting that she was probably already something of a devout and godly woman as well. The reason why I say that is she's living in the home of Simon Peter. Simon Peter is married to her daughter. Remember, Simon Peter had previously been a disciple of John the Baptist, but now, since John the Baptist has been arrested, Simon Peter has started following Jesus. So, in other words, up until this point, this woman with her daughter and her son-in-law, Simon Peter, they've been living together in this household of people who at every point have tried their utmost to follow God and to trust in him while eagerly waiting for God's promised Messiah and the coming kingdom of God. She's probably a devout and godly woman, given the other members of her household. And yet thirdly, and perhaps most extraordinary, is this. that despite all that, despite the fact she's known to Jesus, despite the fact she's known to the other disciples, despite the fact that she's probably a devout and godly woman who's seeking her best to follow God, to trust him, and to follow and to know this Jesus, despite all that, nonetheless, she is now laying ill in bed with a fever and presumably close to death. And I just find this extraordinary. It's an extraordinary reminder and proof that even those who love God and who are loved by God, indeed, even those who are seeking to follow Jesus, even those people can and do sometimes get sick, even to the point of death. In fact, I find this passage here to be every bit as extraordinary as that passage in John chapter 11, where in verse 3 we read about Mary and Martha, who are the sisters of a man by the name of Lazarus. And the sisters sent word to Jesus in John 11, verse 3, saying to him, Lord, Lazarus, whom you love, is ill. Lazarus, our brother, and whom you love, is ill. And then a little bit later on, in verse 27, after the death of Lazarus, their words to Jesus are, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now, admittedly, Jesus would, in just a short time, physically raise Lazarus from the dead. It's one of several occasions on which Jesus raised someone from the dead, someone who had been dead for a number of days. On this occasion, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days, and Jesus, admittedly, is going to raise him from the dead. However, the extraordinary thing, I think, is not simply that Jesus raised him from the dead, although that is extraordinary. Rather, I think it is that Jesus would allow someone that he loved to even become sick and die at all. That's the extraordinary thing, that someone whom Jesus loved would be permitted to get sick and die in the first place. The women, even at their initial words to Jesus, Lord, the disciple, our brother whom you love, is ill, and if you had been here, he would not have died. But it's extraordinary, I think. At least it must be extraordinary to them as women who are seeking to follow Jesus. But look, this whole notion that those who love God and who are loved by Jesus, those who are seeking to follow him, the idea that they should, that they shouldn't or never get sick and die, is nowhere supported in the Bible. Even those who are loved by God and who love Jesus and who are following him, even those people get sick, and even those people will die. And it's coming back to this passage just here. We have this extraordinary statement that even though Simon himself is a disciple of Jesus, even though his motherhood is also in all likelihood also known to Jesus and is trusting God, nonetheless, even she is somehow not immune to being sick or possibly dying. Now, let's just try and back it up even further, though, because I want you to try and imagine as well the conversation being had in Simon Peter's home. Because I think there's some other stuff here which is probably also quite extraordinary. Remember, we already know from elsewhere that Simon and Andrew and James and John had been disciples of John the Baptist up until the time that John had pointed them to Jesus and told them to follow him, and just before John the Baptist himself would be arrested and thrown into prison. And in fact, we know that in just a little while, John the Baptist, who, as I said, is currently in prison, is also going to be killed. He's going to be beheaded by King Herod. And I think, look, when that happens, that in itself also puts to death, I think, that other myth, that you sometimes hear, that, when God closes a door, he always opens a window. Well, I don't know if that's entirely true. I mean, if the death of John the Baptist proves anything, it's that, sometimes when God closes one door, it's so that he might then bring the entire house crashing down upon you. Sometimes God doesn't open a window. Sometimes God has an entirely different purpose altogether. Hence, it's after that that John the Baptist is put into prison, that Jesus now calls Simon and Andrew and James and John to come follow him, and he's going to make them fishers of men. That's what he says. But now, I mean, here we are, we're in Mark chapter 12, and it's less than 12 verses later, and the men have barely even started to follow Jesus before Simon returns home in order to find his mother-in-law now in bed with a fever and presumably close to death. I wonder if you can imagine the possible conversation between Simon and his wife. Here, you know, we're just speculating, but I wonder if they had a conversation that may have gone something like this. You imagine Simon's wife saying to him that, look, you trusted God and you went out to help John the Baptist in telling people about the coming Messiah. Now he's in prison. He's about to be killed. And so since then, you're now following, you're now trusting God and you're following this Jesus. And despite doing that, nonetheless, my mother now is about to die. Maybe you should give this trusting God thing just a little bit more thought. Maybe trusting God and obeying God is not the best thing for us. Maybe trusting God and obeying God is just simply going to lead to one disappointment after another. Look at John, look at my mum, look at... Now, as you say, it's hypothetical, it's purely speculative. The reality is that none of us know truly how they responded. But what we do know is that many people would have, and sometimes do, and that even we, if we're totally honest, have probably felt like that on occasions. We're stepping out, we're trusting God, we're seeking to follow him, we're seeking to follow Jesus. But it hasn't been easy. In some cases, it's been confusing and disappointing. Sometimes things have gone from bad to worse. Sometimes it's just hard work. I wonder if they're having a conversation about that. Have you noticed what it is, though, that they do and the response of Jesus? Look again at verses 30 to 31. It says, now Simon's mother-in-law lay ill with a fever, and immediately they told him, Jesus, about her. He came, he took her by the hand and lifted her up. And the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick and oppressed by demons, or oppressed by demons. The whole city was gathered together at the door. He healed many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons. But he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. Well, for those of us who started at the very beginning of this chapter, that is in the first verse of this chapter, we already know the big reveal. And that is that Jesus has already been introduced in the very first verse of Mark chapter 1 as being nothing less than the very Son of God himself. Meaning that as God in human flesh, Jesus has come into the world with all the power and all the authority of God himself. Therefore, it's little wonder then that having told Jesus about her, that is, having told him about Simon's mother-in-law, that Jesus is now, he now comes to her, takes her hand, at which point she is immediately healed. There's no delay, there's no doctors, there's no medicine. It's simply a straight up miracle, as with absolute power and authority, Jesus is able to heal the woman. In fact, the miracle itself is so obvious and so thorough that not only does the fever leave her so that she's able to begin straight up looking after others in the household, but we also read how by that evening, the entire town who've heard of this miracle have now gathered outside of the door, and we read of Jesus healing many from the town, sick with various diseases, and of even casting out many demons with such authority that he won't even permit them to speak. However, what I want you to notice here, though, is what is and isn't said. Firstly, what is plainly obvious is that Jesus can and does have complete and absolute authority to heal any and all who are sick. The whole town is probably exaggeration, but a very large number of people, many people with various illness, he's able to heal them all. He's able to heal any and all who are sick with complete and absolute authority. That much is obvious. However, what isn't plainly obvious is the exact reason why so many of those people, and indeed us as well, even get sick to begin with. Notice at no point whatsoever are we told exactly why it was that Simon Peter's mother-in-law got sick in the first place, nor of the many others who came with many and various illnesses either. Neither are we told either of any difference between Simon's mother-in-law as someone who probably did know Jesus, or of the many others who probably hadn't heard of Jesus. I mean, it doesn't seem matter whether you know Jesus or you don't know Jesus. The reality is that both groups of people experience illness and get sick. Now, why do I say that? Why am I pointing this out? Well, firstly, because I want to dispel this myth or this assumption or arrogance which pretends or demands that we should always know the reason for a particular sickness or hardship that either we or someone else might be going through. The reality is we don't always know why we get sick. We don't always know why someone else has got sick. At the end of the day, the Bible gives us numerous reasons. There's lots of examples throughout the Bible of different people getting sick for different reasons. Sometimes the full reason might not even be given to us at all. But look, just a quick run through the Bible. You know, some of the different reasons which are given for us and for others getting ill can include anything from the fact that we live in a broken world. You know, we live in a creation which is broken and in which people do get sick, they do die. Creation itself is frustrated, says the Bible. Sometimes we can get sick because we just simply fail to care for ourselves. I mean, you know, if you're one of those people who are going to eat a bag of chips and several chocolate bars, is it any wonder if you end up a diabetic? I mean, if we fail to care for ourselves, that can lead to illness. Sometimes we can get sick because of our own sinfulness, our own destructive habits. Sometimes we can get sick or we can have bad things happen to us because of someone else's sin against us. On some occasions, there are examples in the Bible of people becoming unwell because God is disciplining them or disciplining us so that we might repent of a particular sin. Sometimes we get sick because God is maturing us. He allows us to go through certain things so that we might learn to trust him and to grow in holiness. On at least several occasions, there are examples of people being unwell so that God might be glorified in their healing. And on other occasions, people getting sick and remaining unwell so that God might be glorified in their weakness. So they might have to continue to lean on God even more so. There are examples and occasions of people getting sick as a warning of greater judgment in the future. Sometimes it's a warning of our own mortality. Sometimes we're allowed to get sick as a testimony or an example to others. And sometimes we just don't know. I mean, there are lots of reasons throughout the Bible as to why we sometimes get sick and to why we may even die. So I think we need to just be careful about being too quick to say that we know precisely why someone may or may not be sick or healed. But secondly, I also want to dispel this myth that if you follow Jesus or if you trust in God, then that means you're never going to experience any kind of sickness or suffering or hardship or disappointment. Simon's mother-in-law, John the Baptist, Lazarus, the Apostle Paul, Timothy, King David, the Old Testament prophets, New Testament apostles, countless martyrs, the persecuted church, and 2,000 years of church history all serve to illustrate the truthfulness of Jesus' words in John 16:33. That in this world you will have tribulation, says Jesus. In this world we will have suffering, we'll have hardship, we will experience sickness. In other words, being a Christian does not get us a free pass. But what it does mean, though, is this, and that is that none of these things, including even death itself, none of them are ultimately fatal. Not even death is fatal for the Christian. And likewise, none of these things, suffering and hardship and sickness and tribulation and so forth, none of those things can ultimately separate us from either the love of God or the power of God. That's the promise that God gives to us within the New Testament. In fact, this is the assurance that we have, that by his life and his death on a cross and by his resurrection, that Jesus has reconciled to God any and all who put their trust in him, having rescued us from the power of sin and death and Satan, and now bringing us into the kingdom of God and giving to us a living hope, both in this world and the next. In fact, I want to suggest to you, just in closing, that the greatest miracle in the Gospel of Mark is not the healing of Simon's mother-in-law. Neither is even the description of the whole city or whole town gathering at the doors and windows of Simon's house, desperately looking in and praying that Jesus might heal their loved ones also, which on this occasion he does. Even that is not the greatest miracle. Rather, the greatest miracle comes at the very end, where having become man, God himself, and in the person of Jesus, allows himself to suffer as a man and in our place and for our sin, so as to reconcile us to himself. Then rising from the dead 3 days later with this promise of an end to death and the gift of eternal life to all who would now believe upon him. That's the miracle. That's the miracle. Namely, that the God of the Bible also knows what it is to suffer, and yet does so that in the future we ourselves might be delivered from the power of sin and death and devil, and so experience genuine and everlasting life with him as God's people in God's place and in God's presence forever. That's the miracle. However, between now and that moment, it is little wonder then that someone once put it like this. Let me close with these words. This person a number of years ago wrote, "God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. Deep in his dark and hidden minds, with never failing skill, he fashions all his bright designs and works his sovereign will. O fearful saints, new courage take. The clouds that you now dread are big with mercy and will break in blessings on your head. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. God's purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. Blind unbelief is sure to err and scan his work in vain. God is his own interpreter, and he will make it plain. So God, we trust in you. Oh God, we trust in you. When tears are great and comforts few, we hope for mercies ever new. We trust in you. Amen.